There was an email in my inbox dated Tuesday, March 14th, and it was from someone named Director Catherine Voss at the Mercy Point Lighthouse Foundation. The email was professional but brief. It thanked me for my interest in the keeper position and confirmed that I had successfully completed the initial interview. It stated that I would be contacted within 2 weeks regarding the second phase of evaluation. It was signed with a formal closing and included a reference number that I was to use for any future correspondence. I stared at the email for a very long time that Friday morning. My coffee had gone cold on the desk beside my computer. The cup was one of those ceramic ones with a handle that I'd owned for several years. Part of a set that my ex-wife had purchased before the separation. It's just the logo on the side was faded. Some sort of vacation destination that neither of us had ever visited. I didn't know why I still used these cups. Habit, perhaps. The continuity of objects providing some small anchor to a life that felt increasingly untethered. I had not applied for a lighthouse keeper position. I had not been to an interview. I had not submitted any application materials to any lighthouse foundation. The entire thing was impossible. And yet the email existed in my inbox with a timestamp and a sender address and all the formal markers of legitimacy that the internet had trained me to trust. My name is David Reeves. I'm 41 years old. I have brown hair that is beginning to gray at the temples. I wear glasses because I'm nearsighted and I need the lenses to function in any meaningful way at my work. I tend to wear the same style of clothing repeatedly. Neutral colors, simple cuts. Nothing that requires much thought or decision-making in the morning. This routine of sameness had become comforting to me in ways that I didn't entirely understand. I checked my sent folder to see if I had composed any correspondence with this organization. Nothing. No draft emails, no completed messages, nothing suggesting that I had initiated any kind of contact with a Lighthouse Foundation or its representatives. My sent folder contained only the regular exchanges with the publication that I worked for, emails about article submissions, payment confirmations, minor revisions to pieces I'd written. The exchanges were professional but not warm. There was no indication that anyone at the publication particularly cared about the work I was doing, and only that it was completed on schedule and met the required specifications. I checked my calendar for Tuesday, March 14th. The day was completely clear, no appointments, no notes, no indication that I had spent any significant portion of that day away from my apartment or engaged in anything other than my normal routine. My normal routine at that time consisted of very little. I'd been working from home for the past 14 months, doing freelance writing and editing work for a small online publication. The work was not particularly demanding. It paid enough to cover rent and basic expenses. It allowed me to remain in my apartment for most of the day, which had become my preference after certain events in my personal life that I didn't like to think about. My apartment is small. Studio layout, essentially, each with a separate bedroom that I'd converted into a workspace. The main room contained a couch and a small table and a kitchen area that was barely functional. There was a bathroom with a shower that had inconsistent water pressure, sometimes running scalding hot, sometimes barely warm. The building is older, constructed sometime in the 1970s, and it has that specific smell that old buildings develop. A combination of carpet dust, old plaster, and something vaguely metallic that I've never been able to identify. The smell seemed to intensify during humid weather, as if the building itself was exuding something that had accumulated in its walls over decades. I live alone. I have for 3 years. Before that, I was married, but that situation ended, and I preferred not to detail the reasons. The separation had been complicated. There had been discussion of counseling, but neither of us had pushed hard for it. We had simply acknowledged that the marriage was no longer functioning and had begun the process of legal dissolution. The apartment had been my choice. It was cheap, it was available, and it required no emotional investment. I had furnished it minimally and had attempted to create an environment where I could exist without constantly being reminded of what I had lost. I tried to remember what I had been doing on Tuesday, March 14th. Looking at my calendar, I could see that I had worked on an article for the publication. It was a piece about digital privacy and the ways that personal information was being harvested by social media companies. The article had been mundane, factual, easily researched through existing sources. In fact, I had completed it and submitted it on Tuesday afternoon, or so I believed based on my memory. But there was no record of the submission in my email. I checked my sent folder more carefully. The most recent submission to the publication was dated Monday, March 13th. There was no submission from Tuesday, March 14th. Had I not actually submitted the article? Had I worked on it but failed to complete it? The inconsistency troubled me. My routine was rigid enough that I usually submitted articles on a regular schedule. Missing a submission would have been unusual. I searched my computer for the article file. I found the draft on my hard drive, and the file properties indicated that it had been last modified on Tuesday, March 14th at 2:37 in the afternoon. But the file appeared incomplete. There was no conclusion. The article ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence about government regulation of data collection. Why would I have created a meeting on the day that I was supposed to be working? More importantly, why could I not remember the meeting at all? I composed a response to Director Catherine Voss explaining that I believed there had been a mistake. I wrote with professional politeness. Thank you for your email. I believe there may be some confusion. I have not applied for any lighthouse keeper position, and I do not have any recollection of an interview on March 14th. I wonder if you might have contacted the wrong David Reeves, or if there has been an administrative error of some kind. Please verify your records and contact the correct candidate. I sent the email and I tried to focus on the unfinished article on my screen. And I attempted to complete the conclusion, but my mind kept drifting back to the question of what had happened on Tuesday, March 14th. The not knowing felt more troubling than the actual event would have been. I could tolerate the loss of a day if I could find some rational explanation for it. Stress-related memory loss. A momentary dissociative episode. Some kind of minor neurological event that would not recur. These were all manageable. These could all be addressed or adapted to. But not knowing how to explain the loss of the day felt like standing on an unstable foundation. It felt like reality was not quite as solid as I had believed it to be. I finished the article, submitting it to the publication with a brief note explaining the delay. I ate dinner alone at my small kitchen table while staring out the window at the street below. And the view was not particularly interesting. Parked cars, other apartment buildings, a convenience store across the street. I had lived in this apartment long enough that the view had become unremarkable, blending into the background of my daily perception. The next morning, I received a response from Director Voss. Her email was brief but detailed. Thank you for your response. I've reviewed my records and I can confirm that your interview indeed took place on Tuesday, March 14th at 2 p.m. at the Mercy Point Lighthouse facility. You arrived on time and the interview proceeded for approximately 1 hour. I personally conducted the interview and provided you with a tour of the facility at the conclusion of our meeting. And you seemed very interested in the position, and I gave you written materials regarding the next phase of the evaluation process. I have no record of any administrative error or confusion. I am wondering if there might be a personal issue you are experiencing. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you would like to discuss further, or if there are any concerns about the position or the facility. I sat at my desk and I read this email multiple times, analyzing each sentence, searching for signs of deception or mistake. The level of specific detail was striking. The time of the interview, the duration, the provision of materials, the tour of the facility. Director Voss was not vague or uncertain. She was describing a definite event with precision. There were two possible explanations for this situation. The first was that Director Voss was confused or mistaken or deliberately deceiving me for reasons that I couldn't understand. Perhaps she had interviewed someone else on Tuesday, March 14th, and had confused that person's contact information with mine. Perhaps there was a clerical error in her system. Perhaps the entire thing was some kind of scam or fraudulent scheme. Perhaps there was a man named David Reeves who looked similar to me and had attended an interview at the Lighthouse, and the records had been incorrectly attributed to my email address. The second possibility was more disturbing. The second possibility was that I had experienced missing time, that I had left my apartment on Tuesday, March 14th, perhaps without any conscious awareness of my action, that I had driven to this Lighthouse facility and completed an interview with Director Voss, returned home, and had no memory of the entire incident. This would suggest a psychological issue or some kind of medical condition. It would suggest that something was wrong with me on a level that I had not previously considered. Missing time. The phrase itself sounded like something from a science fiction story or a conspiracy theory. The kind of thing that people claimed had happened to them in supposed alien abduction experiences. The kind of thing that therapists might attribute to trauma-induced dissociation. The kind of thing that would require serious medical investigation if it were real. But the first explanation seemed more likely when I examined it rationally. It seemed more probable than the idea that I'd driven several hours away from my apartment, participated in a job interview, and had no memory of it. Errors happened. Administrative mistakes occurred. The world contained a certain amount of chaos and confusion. That was far more believable than the alternative. But I couldn't shake the second explanation from my mind. I tried to remember Tuesday, March 14th in detail, searching my memory for any small fragment of the day that might support either the idea that I had stayed in my apartment or that I had traveled somewhere. What had I eaten? My memory was vague. I believed I'd eaten breakfast. Cereal, I thought, though I wasn't certain. What had I watched on television? I tried to recall any show or program that I might have seen, but nothing came to mind. The day felt similar to all the other days that had preceded it. My days were very routine. They followed a predictable pattern. Most mornings I woke up and made coffee and sat at my desk and worked on articles. Most afternoons, I took a break for lunch and perhaps a walk around the neighborhood if the weather was decent. Most evenings, I prepared dinner and spent time on my computer or reading. If something significant had happened, if I had left my apartment to drive to a lighthouse facility, wouldn't I have some recollection of the disruption to my normal schedule? Wouldn't I remember driving for several hours? Wouldn't I remember the experience of leaving the city and entering unfamiliar territory? Or were there people who could do such things without remembering them? Were there people whose consciousness could be divided in such a way? I decided that I should investigate further, because the Mercy Point Lighthouse Foundation had an internet presence, a website with some basic information about the organization's history and mission. The website indicated that Mercy Point was a functional lighthouse located on the coast, about 3 hours north of the city where I lived. The lighthouse had been built in 1923. It had been automated in the 1970s, but was now maintained as a heritage site by the foundation. The foundation offered educational tours and hosted occasional events. There was a staff page with photographs of the foundation's employees. Director Catherine Voss's photograph showed a woman in her late 60s with gray hair and a stern expression. She looked directly at the camera with an intensity that I found somewhat unsettling. Her biography indicated that she had worked at the foundation for 32 years. Before that, she had been a structural engineer. She had overseen numerous restoration projects at the lighthouse. She was credited with developing the current educational tour program. I looked up the address of the lighthouse facility, and I entered it into a mapping application. The drive time was estimated at 3 hours and 12 minutes. The facility was located on a coastal road that took me through several small towns before reaching the lighthouse itself, which sat on a rocky promontory that extended into the ocean. I stared at the satellite image of the lighthouse for a very long time. It was a tall white structure with a red band near the top. It sat on a small peninsula of rock and scrub grass. There was a small parking area and what appeared to be a maintenance building. The ocean surrounded it on 3 sides, dark blue water with white caps, visible even in the satellite image. The lighthouse looked real. It looked solid and functional. It looked like the kind of place that would employ a keeper to maintain it. It looked like the kind of place where I might have been interviewed even if I had no memory of the experience. I composed a response to Director Voss. I tried to be honest, while also exploring the possibility that some kind of mistake had occurred. Thank you for your response. I appreciate you taking the time to provide those details. I must admit that I'm quite puzzled by this situation as I have no memory of the interview you describe. I am wondering if you might be willing to provide me with a bit more information. Could you describe what we discussed during the interview, what position I applied for, what your impression was of the conversation? I apologize for the confusion, but I want to be sure that we are discussing the same event. I sent the email and I waited. The response came the next morning. Director Voss wrote that she understood that everyone experienced periods of stress and confusion, and that she didn't want to pressure me. But she did want me to be aware that the position of keeper was not typically a role that received many applications. She wrote that my background and qualifications seemed well suited to the work. She wrote that the position entailed maintaining the lighthouse facility, performing basic repairs, monitoring the automated systems, maintaining records and logs, and occasionally conducting tours for visitors during the summer season. She wrote that the position was full-time and residential. The keeper would live in a small cottage that was located on the Lighthouse grounds. Utilities would be provided by the foundation. There would be a modest salary. She wrote that the work was somewhat isolated, but that many keepers found the solitude to be one of the primary appeals of the position. She asked me to confirm my interest in proceeding to the second phase of the evaluation, which would involve a more detailed discussion of expectations and a review of my background. I read this email several times, analyzing the information she was providing about the job. The position she was describing seemed designed specifically for someone in my situation. I was alone. I had limited social connections. I worked remotely. I had no particular attachment to my current location, whereas the idea of moving to an isolated lighthouse and performing maintenance work had a certain appeal to it, if I was being honest with myself. The appeal was not logical or rational. I had no experience with lighthouse keeping or facility maintenance, but there was something about the idea that called to some part of me that had been quiet and dormant for the past 3 years. But I had not applied for this position. I'd not gone to an interview. I did not have a background in lighthouse keeping or facility maintenance or any of the skills that would be required for such work. Something was wrong. Either Director Voss was deliberately deceiving me for reasons that I couldn't understand, or I had experienced a gap in my memory significant enough to include an entire trip to another location and an interview with a stranger. I decided to drive to the Lighthouse facility. I made the decision on Saturday morning while drinking my 3rd cup of coffee. I didn't announce the decision to anyone because there was no one to announce it to. I didn't make any particular preparation beyond packing a small bag with a change of clothes. I simply decided that I would drive north and see if the lighthouse existed and if Director Voss existed, and if I could somehow verify that what she was describing had actually occurred. The drive took 3 hours and 14 minutes, which was consistent with the estimate provided by the mapping application. I left my apartment early on a Saturday morning and drove north along the coastal highway. The landscape gradually shifted from urban to suburban to rural. The buildings became more sparse. The coastline appeared in the distance, a blue horizon that grew progressively as you go closer as I drove. I passed through several small towns. Each one seemed to consist of a main street with a few shops and restaurants that looked as though they had not been updated since the 1980s. A diner with a large front window, an antique shop, a gas station with older-style pumps, a real estate office with listings displayed in the window. The kind of places that served the scattered population in the surrounding area, people who had chosen to live in these small communities for reasons that I couldn't quite fathom. Were they drawn by the natural beauty? Were they fleeing from something in their past? Were they native to these towns and had simply remained? As I drove further north, even these towns became more sparse. The highway became more winding, where the vegetation on either side of the road became increasingly wild and unmanicured. I saw occasional houses set back from the road, older structures that suggested a rural population spread across a large geographic area. Some of the houses looked abandoned. Paint was peeling, roofs appeared to be deteriorating. I wondered how long it had been since people had lived in some of these structures. Years? Decades? The GPS indicated that the lighthouse facility was still 15 miles away. I was driving through the landscape, and I was beginning to doubt the reality of what I was doing. 3 hours in a car is a long time. 3 hours is enough time to reconsider your decisions. 3 hours is enough time to question your mental state and wonder if you're making a serious mistake. But I continued driving, yet the GPS led me to a small parking area at the end of a paved road. The area consisted of a few spaces marked for parking and a small entrance area with an information kiosk. Beyond that, I could see the lighthouse. It was much larger in person than it appeared in the satellite image. The white paint was weathered and in some places appeared to be peeling. The red band near the top was a faded, dull red that suggested years of exposure to salt air and wind. The structure looked old and somewhat tired, like something that had been maintaining itself against the ocean for nearly a century and was showing the wear of that effort. The sight of the lighthouse created a strange sensation in my chest. Recognition, perhaps, though I had no conscious memory of ever seeing it before, or something else, or it's something that existed in the space between recognition and strangeness. I parked my car and I got out. The wind was stronger here than I had expected. The air smelled like salt and something else, some kind of seaweed or rotting vegetation mixed with the mineral scent of sea spray. The sun was partially obscured by clouds. The temperature was cold enough that I wished I had worn a heavier jacket. The cold seemed to carry a dampness that penetrated through my thin jacket and worked its way into my bones. I walked toward the entrance area. There was a small building adjacent to the main entrance. Through a window, I could see what appeared to be an office space, a desk, filing cabinets, a person sitting in a chair, reading something. I pushed open the door and I entered the building. The interior was warm, which was a relief. Curious, the sudden shift from the cold wind outside to the warmth of the interior felt almost shocking to my system. There was a small reception area, and behind it, an office. The woman who was sitting at the desk looked up as I entered. She was perhaps in her 50s, with dark hair and a practical expression. She put down the paper she had been reading. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for Director Catherine Voss," I said. "Is she available?" "I'm Catherine Voss," the woman said. She stood up and extended her hand. "And you must be David Reeves." She extended her hand and I shook it. Her grip was firm. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested recognition. "You remember me," I said. It wasn't a question. "Of course I remember you," she said. "We met on Tuesday. You were here for your interview." I looked at her carefully. I was searching for some indication that she was lying or mistaken or playing some kind of game, but her expression remained steady. She seemed entirely confident in what she was saying. She was looking at me as if I were a person she had spent an hour with only a few days ago, as if the interview had been a real event in her memory. "I need to be honest with you," I said. "I don't have any memory of being here on Tuesday. I don't remember applying for this position. I don't remember driving here or meeting with you." Director Voss regarded me for a moment without speaking. The silence stretched between us. I could hear the wind outside moving around the building. I could hear the distant sound of waves striking rocks. I could hear my own breathing, which seemed too loud in the quiet room. "That's interesting," she said finally. "Come with me, let me show you something." Part 2. The evidence. She turned and walked deeper into the building. I followed her. We passed through a small hallway lined with photographs. Black and white images, some of them faded with age. They showed the lighthouse in different seasons, and at different times of day. Some of them showed people standing in front of the lighthouse. Some showed the interior of the structure. Some showed views of the ocean from various vantage points. We entered a back office that was larger than the reception area. There was a desk with a computer and a filing system. There were several documents arranged neatly on the desk. Director Voss picked up one of the documents and handed it to me. It was a handwritten form. At the top, it was titled Keeper Position Interview, Mercy Point Lighthouse Foundation. Below that was a series of questions and answers, all in handwriting that I could not immediately identify. The form was dated March 14th. I looked at the handwriting more carefully. It was similar to my own handwriting, but not identical. The formation of the letters was slightly different. The spacing between words was more consistent than my natural handwriting. The way the R was formed in words like interview and keeper was slightly more angular than how I typically wrote. But someone who didn't know me well might have thought it was my writing. "This is from your interview?" Director Voss said. "You filled out this form as part of the evaluation process. You answered questions about your background, your experience, your reasons for being interested in the position." I read through the form. The answers were written in a voice that sounded somewhat like me, but the content was not entirely accurate. The answers spoke to experience in facility maintenance that I didn't have. The answers referenced a particular interest in solitude and isolation that felt manufactured, like something that had been constructed to match what the interviewer was looking for. In response to what attracts you to the keeper position, the form read, "I am interested in work that provides meaningful engagement with the physical world. I have been working in a sedentary career and feel disconnected from tangible results. The idea of maintaining a functioning structure that serves an important purpose appeals to me. I am also seeking a change in my living situation. I have been isolated in a way that feels unhealthy, and I believe that a new environment might provide an opportunity to develop a healthier relationship with solitude." The answer was articulate and thoughtful. It sounded like something that I might have said if I had been thinking carefully about the question. But I had no memory of thinking this thought, much less of expressing it to another person. "I didn't write this," I said. My voice sounded uncertain, even to my own ears. "You wrote it during the interview," Director Voss said. "You sat in this office for approximately 1 hour. We discussed the position. I explained the responsibilities. You asked questions. At the end of the interview, I asked you to complete this form. You completed it and you signed it at the bottom." I looked at the bottom of the form. There was a signature, or it was my signature, or it was very close to my signature. The shape and flow of the letters matched my own handwriting. The way the capital D sprawled at the beginning of the surname, the way the double E in Reeves was formed. These elements matched my signature, but I had no memory of having written it. "There's something else," Director Voss said. She pulled another document from the filing system. It was a printed photograph. In the photograph, I was standing in front of the lighthouse. I was wearing the same clothes that I was wearing now, which was unusual because I had not changed clothes since the day I drove to the lighthouse. But the photograph was dated March 14th, which was more than a week ago. "We took this photograph at the end of the tour," Director Voss said. "You were standing in front of the lighthouse. You seemed very interested in the facility at that point. You asked many questions about the maintenance systems and the structure of the building. I looked at the photograph. It was definitely me in the image. There was no doubt about that. My face, my body, my clothes. But the version of me in the photograph was someone who, I couldn't quite connect with. It was like looking at a photograph of yourself from years ago and not recognizing the person in the image. I think I'm experiencing some kind of memory loss, I said. My voice felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I think I might need to see a doctor. That's possible, Director Voss said, but it's also possible that there's another explanation. What explanation? I asked. I don't know yet, she said, but I've worked at this lighthouse for 32 years. You know, I've conducted interviews for the keeper position many times. I've never encountered anything like what's happening with you. What do you mean? I asked. I mean that you showed up on Tuesday at the scheduled time, exactly as planned. We conducted the interview. At the end, I gave you a packet of materials that explained the next steps in the evaluation process. Then we took the photograph at the entrance. You left the facility at approximately 3:15 p.m. You got in your car and you drove away. She paused, as if deciding whether to continue. I remember watching you drive away, she said. I stood at the entrance and I watched your car until it disappeared down the road. I remember thinking that you seemed like you were a person who had made a decision about your life. Not an uncertain person, not someone who was exploring options. Someone who had already decided to take the position even though I hadn't formally offered it to you yet. I tried to process what she was telling me. The specificity of the details, the confidence in her recollection, the sense that she was describing something that had definitely occurred. I want to speak with her, I said. There was a staff member here that day. She saw me arrive. She saw me during the interview. I want to talk to her and confirm that you're telling me the truth. She's not here today, Director Voss said. But you can contact her through the Foundation's office. Her name is Patricia Chen. She came in that day specifically to help with the interview process. She can confirm everything I've told you. I stood in the office, holding the photograph and the form, and trying to make sense of what I was being told. I think I should leave, I said. Before you go, Director Voss said, I want to give you something. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a packet of materials. It was a folder containing several pages of information about the keeper position, job description, facility specifications, information about the compensation package, contact information for the Foundation. The materials were the kind of thing that would have been given to someone during an interview. You were supposed to receive this packet on Tuesday, Director Voss said, but apparently you didn't take it with you. I'm giving it to you now. I want you to review the information. I want you to take some time to think about whether this is a position that interests you. And I want you to contact me if you have any questions. I took the packet. The folder felt substantial in my hands. There was enough information to constitute a serious job offer. There's one more thing, Director Voss said. When you were here on Tuesday, you mentioned that you had been going through some personal difficulties. You said that you were looking for a change in your life. You said that the idea of living and working in a remote location appealed to you because you wanted to get away from your current situation. Do you remember saying any of that? No, I said. You did, Director Voss said. You were very open about it. It seemed like you were looking for something, and you seemed like you believed that this position might provide it. I left the Lighthouse facility and I drove back to the city. The drive back seemed longer than the drive there. I was exhausted in a way that I couldn't quite explain. My mind was turning over the events of the past few days, trying to construct some kind of narrative that would make sense of what was happening. There were several possibilities. One, I had actually driven to the Lighthouse on Tuesday, had completed the interview, had met Director Voss, had signed documents and posed for a photograph, and had then experienced a complete memory loss of the event. This would suggest a serious medical issue or psychological problem. It would suggest that something was fundamentally wrong with my brain or my mind. 2, Director Voss was lying or mistaken. She had confused me with someone else. The photograph had been fabricated or was not actually from Tuesday. Or the form had been written by someone else, but was being attributed to me. This seemed less likely given the specificity of the details and the apparent sincerity of her responses, but it was still possible. 3, I had somehow been compelled or manipulated into driving to the Lighthouse without consciously choosing to do so. I had participated in an interview in some kind of altered state. I had signed documents and posed for photographs. While not being fully aware of what I was doing, this seemed like the kind of thing that belonged in a psychological thriller or a science fiction story, not in the real world. But the evidence was there. The email existed. The form existed. The photograph existed. Director Voss existed, and she had memories of meeting me. Besides, a staff member named Patricia Chen existed and could presumably confirm the details. I drove back to the city in a state of confusion and considerable anxiety. When I arrived home, I went directly to my computer and I searched for information about missing time and memory loss. I found articles about dissociation and fugue states. I read about amnesia and traumatic brain injury. I looked up information about psychological conditions that could cause gaps in memory. I read about temporal lobe epilepsy and other neurological conditions that could affect memory formation. Most of the information suggested that if I was experiencing significant memory loss, I should see a doctor as soon as possible. I should have a neurological evaluation. I should get a psychological assessment. There were many possible causes, each ranging from the benign to the seriously concerning. Some of them were treatable. Some of them were progressive. Some of them required emergency medical attention. I made an appointment with my doctor for the following Monday. But in the days between my visit to the Lighthouse and the doctor's appointment, something strange began to happen. I started to remember Tuesday. Part 3. The return of memory. The memories came gradually at first. Small fragments that seemed to appear unbidden in my mind while I was doing something else. I would be washing dishes, and suddenly I would remember the parking area at the Lighthouse. I would be lying in bed, and suddenly I would feel the salt air on my face. I would be walking to the convenience store, and suddenly I would remember the spiral staircase inside the Lighthouse Tower. These fragments seemed to emerge from nowhere. They were not memories that I consciously recalled or that I could force into being. They were more like images that appeared in my mind when I wasn't actively thinking about something else. They had a quality of intrusion, as if they were being inserted into my consciousness by some external force. But as the days passed, the fragments became more detailed. I began to remember walking into the Lighthouse facility reception area. I began to remember the interior of Director Voss's office. I began to remember her asking me questions about my background and my reasons for being interested in the position. The memories had a strange quality. They felt real, but they also felt slightly distant, as if I were remembering something that had happened to someone else, and I was only now learning about it. The sensory details were present. I could remember the smell of the salt air. I could remember the feeling of the cold wind. I could remember the sound of waves crashing against rocks. But there was a quality of watching rather than experiencing. It was as if I were viewing a film of the events rather than recalling my actual participation in them. On Saturday, 5 days after my visit to the Lighthouse, I had recovered enough of the memory that I could reconstruct most of Tuesday in considerable detail. I remembered telling Director Voss about my failed marriage. I remembered telling her about my work situation and how isolated I had become. I remembered her explaining the job responsibilities in careful, measured terms. I remembered her suggesting that the isolation of the Lighthouse position might actually be therapeutic for someone who was dealing with the kind of personal difficulties that I had described. I remembered the tour of the facility. I remembered climbing the spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse. I remembered looking out at the ocean from the top. The view had been expansive and somewhat overwhelming. The horizon seemed to stretch indefinitely. The ocean moved in patterns that seemed too complex to fully comprehend. I remembered thinking that standing at the top of the lighthouse gave me a sense of perspective that I had lost during the 3 years that I had been living in my small apartment. I remembered standing in front of the lighthouse while she took the photograph. I remembered the way the wind was moving my hair. I remembered the feeling of the cold air. I remembered a sense of rightness at that moment, a sense that I was standing in a place where I was supposed to be. The memories were vivid and detailed, and they contradicted what I had told myself for the past week. I had not simply forgotten the day because of some medical condition. The day was still there in my memory. It had just been inaccessible for a while, emerging gradually as my mind processed what had happened. On Monday morning, I canceled my doctor's appointment. I told the receptionist that I was feeling better and that I didn't think the appointment was necessary. She asked me to confirm that I wanted to cancel, and I confirmed. She noted in the system that I canceled, and we ended the call. I sat at my desk, and I reviewed the materials that Director Voss had given me. The packet contained a detailed description of the keeper position. The role involved maintaining the lighthouse structure, performing repairs as needed, monitoring the automated beacon system, maintaining records and logs of all maintenance work, and occasionally conducting tours for visitors during the peak tourist season in the summer. The facility consisted of a main lighthouse structure, a maintenance building with equipment and supplies, a small cottage where the keeper would reside, and an access road that connected to the coastal highway. The keeper would be responsible for security, basic housekeeping of the common areas, basic maintenance of mechanical systems, and notification of the foundation office if any serious problems arose. The position was full-time and residential. The keeper would work alone. Here there would be minimal contact with other foundation staff or the public, except during the summer tourist season when tours would be scheduled on a limited basis. The salary was modest, but sufficient for a single person with minimal expenses. The foundation would provide utilities and basic maintenance supplies. The keeper would be responsible for purchasing personal items and food. As I read through the materials, I began to have an unusual thought. What if I actually wanted to take this position? What if the initial instinct that had driven me to visit the lighthouse was not an aberration or a symptom of a mental health crisis, but rather a genuine desire to change my life? What if the missing memory was not a problem but a solution? What if I had consciously decided to apply for this position, had driven to the lighthouse, had completed the interview, and had then convinced myself that I didn't remember it because I was afraid of the decision I had made? I had been alone for 3 years. I had been working from home. I had minimal social connection. My apartment felt like a cell that I'd voluntarily constructed around myself. The walls were white. The furniture was sparse and utilitarian. I owned very few possessions. There were no photographs or personal items that might give evidence of a life beyond the walls of the apartment. The lighthouse position offered an escape from that situation. It offered isolation, yes, but it offered it in a different context. The isolation at the lighthouse would have purpose. The isolation would be connected to work. The isolation would be connected to a place that had history and significance beyond my own personal narrative. It was possible that some part of me had recognized this opportunity and had taken action to pursue it, while another part of me had resisted and had convinced itself that memory loss had occurred. It was possible that the week of confusion and doubt had been my own mind engaging in a kind of internal conflict between the part of me that wanted to stay safe and the part of me that wanted to make a fundamental change. I picked up the phone and I called Director Voss. She answered on the third ring. "Director Voss, it's David Reeves," I said. "I've been thinking about our conversation and I'm interested in moving forward with the evaluation process for the keeper position." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. I could hear what sounded like papers being moved. I could hear the sound of wind outside, similar to the wind that I had heard at the lighthouse. "I'm very glad to hear that," she said finally. "When can you be available for the second phase of the evaluation?" "How soon would that need to happen?" I asked. "We could schedule it for next week if you're available," she said, "or we could wait if you need more time to prepare." "Next week would be fine," I said. "I'm ready to proceed." "Excellent," she said. "I'll have Patricia send you the details via email. The evaluation will take approximately 4 hours. We'll need to discuss your background in more detail, review your responses to the initial interview, and have you spend some time at the facility to get a better sense of what the work would entail." "That sounds reasonable," I said. After we ended the call, I sat at my desk and I considered what I had just committed to. If I proceeded with this, I would need to give up my current apartment lease. Most leases required 30 days notice, and my lease would be up for renewal in about 6 weeks. If I wanted to move sooner, I would have to pay a penalty. But given the financial situation, the penalty seemed manageable. I would need to arrange to have my belongings transported to the lighthouse facility or to put them in storage. Given the size and quantity of my possessions, most of it could probably go into storage. I owned very little that seemed worth transporting to a new location, or I would need to end my freelance work arrangement or see if I could continue working remotely from the lighthouse. The publication that I worked for had never expressed any preference about where I worked. They only cared that the articles were submitted on time. Working from the lighthouse might even be preferable from their perspective, as it would mean fewer communications from me, fewer requests for adjustments or clarifications. The decision seemed enormous and irreversible, but at the same time, it seemed inevitable. I had apparently already made the decision once, even if I had no memory of making it. Perhaps I had been waiting for the second opportunity to confirm what I had already decided. Perhaps the period of missing memory had been some kind of test or trial. Perhaps my unconscious mind had needed to confirm that I was serious about this decision before allowing me to proceed. That night, I slept better than I had slept in weeks. The sleep was deep and undisturbed. I woke up in the morning without the usual sense of dread that typically accompanied the start of my day. Part 4. The Evaluation. The second phase of the evaluation was scheduled for the following Thursday. The email from Patricia Chen provided details about what I should expect. I would arrive at the Lighthouse facility at 9 a.m. The evaluation would take approximately 4 hours. I should bring comfortable shoes and clothes appropriate for walking on uneven terrain. The foundation would provide lunch. I should plan to spend time in the Lighthouse Tower and in the maintenance building, each would becoming familiar with the various systems and structures. I prepared carefully for the evaluation. I bought new hiking boots as my current shoes were worn and not suitable for walking on rocky terrain. I packed a bag with appropriate clothing. I prepared written answers to potential interview questions. Though I assumed this was unnecessary, given that Director Voss had presumably already asked me these questions during the first interview. The drive north on Thursday morning was different from my first drive to the lighthouse. This time, the route was familiar. I recognized the small towns that I passed. I recognized the way the coastline gradually came into view as I drove further north. I recognized the parking area when I arrived. This time, when I arrived at the Lighthouse facility, I did remember my first visit. The memories were there, accessible in my mind. I remembered walking into the reception building. I remembered the interview with Director Voss. I remembered her taking my photograph. The memories had a strange quality to them. They didn't feel like they were memories of something that had happened to me. They felt more like memories of a story that I had been told. They were detailed and consistent, but they maintained a quality of distance. Patricia Chen was waiting for me in the reception area. She was a woman in her mid-50s with black hair and a direct manner of speaking. She wore a Foundation-branded polo shirt and comfortable pants. "Welcome back," she said. "Director Voss is ready for you. Let's start with a tour of the facility." Patricia led me out of the building and toward the lighthouse structure. As we walked, she explained the basic history of the facility and the responsibilities of the keeper position. "The lighthouse was built in 1923, she said, speaking in the tone of someone who had given this explanation many times before. The original structure had a keeper who lived here full-time. The keeper was responsible for lighting the beacon at dusk and extinguishing it at dawn, and for maintaining the entire structure. The work was demanding and the isolation was significant. Back then, there were very few women keepers, and the few who worked in the position usually had family support." We approached the base of the lighthouse. "The lighthouse was automated in the 1970s, she continued. "That means the beacon system now runs automatically without requiring human intervention. The light comes on at dusk and goes off at dawn based on light sensors. The beacon rotates automatically. Signals are sent to the Foundation office if any problems arise. From a technical standpoint, the lighthouse doesn't require a keeper anymore." She opened a door and we stepped inside the base of the lighthouse. "However, the building still needs to be maintained," she said. "The automated systems need to be monitored. The structure itself is old and requires regular upkeep. The windows need to be cleaned. The paint needs to be maintained. Minor repairs need to be made. And there's the educational aspect. Many people want to visit lighthouses and learn about their history. So we maintain the keeper position more for heritage reasons than for functional necessity. We began to climb the spiral staircase. Then the steps were narrow and the stairwell was dark, illuminated only by occasional windows that looked out toward the ocean. The climb took several minutes. My new boots were stiff and slightly uncomfortable as I stepped repeatedly on the narrow stairs. By the time we reached the top, my legs were tired and my breathing was slightly elevated. At the top of the lighthouse, there was a circular room that contained the beacon mechanism. The room was ringed with windows that provided a panoramic view of the ocean and the surrounding landscape. I could see for miles in every direction. The ocean stretched out to the horizon, a landscape of blue-gray water and the occasional white cap of waves. The coastline extended north and south, a line of rocky shore and sandy beach, punctuated with occasional small communities and private residences. This is what the keeper would see on a regular basis, Patricia said. The beacon is automated, but the keeper is responsible for monitoring its operation. Occasionally, there are minor repairs needed. Sometimes the lens needs to be cleaned. Sometimes a sensor malfunctions. It's work that requires attention to detail and a willingness to climb these stairs regularly. Most keepers report that the view makes the climb worthwhile. I looked out at the ocean and I felt something shift in my chest. A recognition of something. A sense of rightness. How many keepers have you had? I asked. Over the years, Patricia said, quite a few. The position has never had a high retention rate. People come, they work for a year or two, and then they leave. Some people find the isolation too difficult. Others find that the work doesn't provide enough challenge. Some people just decide they want to move back to the city. Director Voss has been here 32 years, and I've been here for 23. We're probably the longest-serving staff members. We descended the staircase, and we moved to the maintenance building. The maintenance building was a smaller structure adjacent to the main lighthouse. It contained various tools and equipment related to the upkeep of the lighthouse. There were electrical panels and plumbing supplies. There were cleaning materials and spare parts for the beacon system. Patricia explained the various responsibilities of the keeper in maintaining these systems. The keeper would need to learn basic electrical troubleshooting. The keeper would need to understand the water systems that supplied the lighthouse, and the keeper would need to know how to perform basic repairs on the mechanical components of the beacon. Most keepers come to us without previous experience, Patricia said. Director Voss and I provide training. There's a period of about 2 weeks where the keeper is learning the systems and establishing a routine. After that, they're usually on their own. We check in regularly by phone. But the actual work of maintaining the facility is done by the keeper alone. Then we move to the keeper's cottage. The cottage was a small structure with 2 rooms and a bathroom. One room was a bedroom with a narrow bed and a small dresser. The other room served as a living area and kitchen. The walls were painted a pale beige. The furniture was simple and utilitarian. There was a window in the living area that faced toward the lighthouse, and there was a small stove and a refrigerator, both older models but apparently functional. A narrow table with 2 chairs occupied the corner of the room. This is where the keeper would live, Patricia said. It's modest, but it's functional. The foundation provides utilities. There's heat in the winter and electricity for appliances. The keeper would be responsible for keeping the space clean and maintaining the basic systems. In summer, when we have tourists, the keeper is expected to keep this area presentable in case visitors ask to see it as part of the heritage tour. I walked through the cottage and I tried to imagine myself living there. I tried to envision waking up in this small bedroom with the window looking out toward the lighthouse. I tried to imagine spending my days maintaining the lighthouse and my evenings reading or working in this small living space. The image was not unpleasant, and in fact it felt increasingly appealing to me. The simplicity of the space, the proximity to the ocean, the isolation from the rest of the world. After the tour, I met with Director Voss for the second phase of the evaluation. We sat in her office and we discussed my background in detail. She asked me about my work history. I explained my work as a freelance writer and editor for the online publication. I explained that I had been doing this work for about 3 years after leaving a previous job in a publishing house. I explained that the remote work arrangement had been appealing at first, but had gradually become isolating. She asked me about my living situation. I explained that I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. I explained that I had limited social connections. I explained that most of my days involved working at my computer and having minimal interaction with other people. She asked me about my reasons for being interested in the lighthouse position. I tried to explain what I was looking for. I tried to articulate the sense of isolation that had become so familiar to me that it felt like a part of my identity. I tried to describe the appeal of the lighthouse, the way that the isolation seemed like it might be transformed into something positive or purposeful. I tried to express the feeling that I had experienced at the top of the lighthouse, the sense of perspective that the view provided. The lighthouse has a particular quality, Director Voss said, when she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands in front of her on the desk. People who are drawn to it often speak about a sense of clarity. They say that the isolation allows them to think more clearly about their lives. They say that the work is simple enough, that it doesn't demand constant attention, but it's still meaningful. The routine of it is comforting. That sounds appealing, I said. That's part of what's drawing me to this work. It is, Director Voss said. But you should understand that it's not an escape from your problems. It's an opportunity to face your problems in a different environment. Some people find that helpful. Others find that the isolation makes things worse. There's no way to predict which category a person falls into until they've been here for a while. How long do most keepers stay? I asked. It varies, Director Voss said. Some people stay for a few years, some stay longer, some leave after a few months. There's no right length of time. The position works for different people in different ways. What matters is that the keeper is doing the work responsibly and that they're not becoming psychologically destabilized by the isolation. She paused, as if considering whether to say something else. I've been doing this job for 32 years, she said. I've hired maybe 40 or 50 keepers over that time. The ones who stay the longest are usually the ones who are running from something. Not in a desperate way, but in a thoughtful way. They're people who recognize that their current lives aren't working for them and who are willing to try something radically different. She looked at me directly. I think you might be that kind of person, she said. At the end of the evaluation, Director Voss offered me the position. "I believe you're well suited for this work," she said. "Your responses to the interview questions demonstrate that you've thought carefully about what this position would entail. Your tour of the facility today showed genuine interest in the work. I'd like to offer you the keeper position, effective immediately. You could begin work next week if that's acceptable to you." I accepted the position without hesitation. Part 5. The transition. The transition happened very quickly. I gave notice to my apartment landlord and began the process of terminating my lease. They were understanding and agreed to let me out of the lease without penalty, provided I gave them 30 days notice and the apartment was left in good condition. I arranged to move out by the end of April. I contacted the publication that I worked for and explained that I was leaving. They were understanding and offered to keep me on as a remote freelancer if I wanted to continue doing occasional work. They understood that remote work arrangements could be maintained from anywhere with internet access, and they were open to the arrangement if I was interested. I accepted this offer, thinking that having some income stream would be helpful. It would give me something to structure my days around, at least initially. I arranged for a moving company to transport my belongings. Most of my furniture went into storage. A small unit at a storage facility about an hour from the Lighthouse. I packed a suitcase with personal items and another box with books and a few other possessions that I wanted to keep with me. The process of packing my apartment and preparing to leave was surprisingly straightforward. I owned very little. There were no photographs to frame or arrange. There were no decorations that needed to be carefully transported. There were books and clothes and the laptop computer that I used for work. Everything else could be left behind or stored or donated. The apartment seemed to shrink as I packed. Without my possessions, it seemed to become a smaller and smaller space. By the time I'd packed everything and arranged for it to be transported, the apartment looked completely empty. The walls were white. The carpet was bare. There was no evidence that I had lived there for 3 years. Director Voss met me at the cottage, and she gave me a tour of all the systems and equipment that I would need to know how to operate. She showed me the electrical panel and the water shutoff. She showed me how to access the Lighthouse tower and the automated beacon system. She showed me the maintenance schedules and the record-keeping system. She introduced me to Patricia, and who would be my primary contact at the foundation office, and explained the procedures for requesting assistance if problems arose. "You'll have a period of transition," Director Voss said. "We recommend a week or two where you're learning the systems and establishing a routine. After that, you'll be on your own. Patricia will check in with you regularly by phone, and you can contact the office if any serious problems arise. But for the most part, the position is independent. The work is what you make of it." That night, I slept in the keeper's cottage for the first time in my new capacity as keeper. The bed was narrow and the mattress was firm. There were sounds that I didn't recognize. The wind outside, the distant sound of waves, the creaking of the old building, the occasional groan of pipes. I lay awake for several hours, listening to these sounds and trying to adjust to the reality of where I was. The cottage was quiet in a way that the apartment had never been. In the apartment, there had always been background noise, traffic from the street, neighbors in adjacent units, the occasional siren in the distance. Here, there was only the sound of the wind and the ocean and the building itself. The silence felt profound. Eventually, I slept. Part 6. The routine. The next morning, I woke up and I went through the routine that Director Voss had taught me. I made coffee in the small kitchen and I sat at the table and reviewed the maintenance log from the previous day, a log that had been maintained by the foundation staff while I was in transition. The coffee was strong and warm. I held the cup in both hands and I looked out the window at the lighthouse. I checked the automated systems in the lighthouse using the procedures that I had been taught. I inspected the beacon mechanism. I reviewed the maintenance log and I made notes about what I observed. I performed basic cleaning in the common areas of the lighthouse. The work was simple and methodical. It was exactly the kind of work that I had been looking for. By the end of the first week, I had established a pattern to my days. I would wake up at 6 a.m. I would make coffee and review the maintenance log from the previous day. I would climb to the top of the lighthouse and check on the beacon system. I would spend an hour or two doing whatever maintenance work was necessary, cleaning windows, performing basic repairs, checking connections. I would have lunch at around noon. I would spend the afternoon reviewing records or doing repairs in the maintenance building or reading books that I had brought with me. I would prepare dinner in the evening. I would work on freelance assignments or read in the evening. I would go to bed around 10 p.m. The routine was almost meditative in its simplicity. There were no emails to respond to beyond the occasional message from the publication asking me to work on an article. No social obligations, no decisions to make about what to do with my time beyond the decisions about the work that needed to be done. The work that needed to be done was self-evident. I performed it, and then I was free to do whatever I wanted. The isolation was profound, and it felt different from the isolation of the apartment. In the apartment, the isolation had felt like confinement. It had felt like I was hiding from the world. It had felt like I was failing at something that I should have been able to do. At the lighthouse, the isolation felt like a choice. It felt like I had intentionally selected a life of solitude. It felt like the isolation was serving a purpose. I rarely saw another person. Patricia would call the office line once a week to check in on me, but these calls were brief and professional. She would ask if the systems were functioning properly. I would report that everything was fine. We would make small talk for a minute or two and then end the call. Occasionally, visitors would arrive for tours, but since the lighthouse was open to the public only during the summer season, these visits were minimal in the early spring. When visitors did arrive, I would conduct brief tours of the facility, explaining the history of the lighthouse and the function of the beacon system. The visitors were usually polite and interested. They would ask questions about what it was like to live at the lighthouse. I would give them brief, honest answers. I found that I enjoyed the work. I found that the routine provided a structure that my life had been lacking. I found that the maintenance of the lighthouse was the kind of work that felt meaningful in a way that writing articles for an online publication had never felt meaningful. The days began to feel like they were part of a larger pattern, a pattern that extended beyond my own life and my own concerns. Part 7. The first disturbance. About 3 weeks into the position, I noticed something unusual. There was a gap in the maintenance log. The maintenance log was a record book that I was supposed to update daily, noting any work that I performed, any observations about the lighthouse systems, and any significant events. I had been keeping this log religiously, noting each morning's inspection and each afternoon's activities. The log was the primary documentation of the work being done at the lighthouse, but there was a date missing. According to the calendar, it was April 17th. But the maintenance log went from April 16th directly to April 18th. There was no entry for April 17th. I checked my personal calendar on my computer. April 17th was 3 days ago. I tried to remember what I'd done on April 17th. I had no memory of that day. I could remember April 16th. I could remember April 18th. But April 17th was completely absent from my memory. I stood in the lighthouse with the maintenance log in my hand, and I felt something cold move through my chest. This was the same thing that had happened before. I had lost a day. I had no memory of what I had done or where I had been. I looked in my work area to see if there was any evidence of what I had done on April 17th. There was no indication that I had been in the lighthouse that day. The beacon log showed no entries for that date. The maintenance equipment appeared undisturbed. I tried to reconstruct the day. What had I eaten? I didn't know. Where had I been? I didn't know. Had I left the facility? I didn't know. I had no memory of any of it. I called Patricia at the foundation office. Patricia, I have a question about the maintenance procedures, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. How often should the lighthouse beacon be inspected? Daily, Patricia said. You should be checking it at least once a day, usually in the morning. Why do you ask? I'm just trying to make sure I'm following the procedures correctly, I said. Is there a problem? Patricia asked. No problem, I said. I was just confirming. I hung up the phone. I reviewed the maintenance log again. There was definitely a gap on April 17th, which no entry, no record, no indication that I'd performed any of my daily maintenance checks. I opened my computer and I checked my email. There were no messages from April 17th. There were no timestamps showing that I had accessed my computer that day. I tried to think about what had happened, but there was nothing to think about. The day was simply gone. The cold feeling in my chest persisted. I made a decision. I decided to write an entry in the maintenance log for April 17th. I would backdate it. I would write, daily inspection completed. Beacon system functioning normally. No issues observed. Then I put the log away and I tried not to think about it. But the gap in my memory troubled me. It troubled me enough that I began to pay careful attention to my memory in general. I began to notice when I couldn't clearly remember something. I began to track whether I was having difficulty with my sense of time or my recollection of events. For several weeks after April 17th, everything seemed normal. I had clear memories of each day. The maintenance log was complete. There were no gaps. Then, on May 5th, I noticed another gap. I had no memory of May 4th. The maintenance log showed that I'd performed my usual inspection and noted that the beacon system was functioning normally. But I had no personal recollection of the day. This time, I didn't wait around trying to remember. I immediately began to keep detailed records on my computer. I created a document where I would log each day's activities with as much detail as possible. I would note what I ate, what time I woke up, what time I went to bed, what work I performed. The document would allow me to verify that my days were actually occurring, even if I didn't have a complete memory of them. The document would serve as a kind of backup memory system. If I lost a day, I would at least have a record of what I had done during that day. By the end of May, I had identified 5 days where my memory was completely absent. May 4th, May 11th, May 18th, May 25th, and June 1st. All of them were about a week apart. All of them were marked with entries in the maintenance log that I apparently wrote but didn't remember writing. All of them showed consistent patterns in my computer log. The same meals, the same sleep schedule, the same work completed. The entries were all nearly identical. Daily inspection completed. Beacon system functioning normally. No issues observed. The pattern was becoming obvious. Once per week, I lost a day. The day would follow a completely predictable pattern, but I would have no conscious memory of experiencing it. I called Patricia again. "Patricia, I need to talk to someone about a medical issue," I said. "I'm experiencing some memory problems. I'm losing track of time. I'm having gaps in my memory. I think I need to see a doctor." "That sounds serious," Patricia said. "Have you been experiencing anything else? Dizziness, headaches, changes in your sleep pattern?" "No," I said. "Nothing physical, just memory problems. I'll lose an entire day and have no memory of it, but the maintenance log shows that I did the work, so I must have been here and I must have done the routine maintenance, but I have no conscious experience of it." "That's concerning," Patricia said. Have you thought about taking a leave of absence? You could come back to the city and see a doctor. We can arrange for someone else to come out and monitor the lighthouse while you're away." "I don't want to leave," I said. "I want to stay here. I just want to understand what's happening to me." "You can stay," Patricia said, "but I'm going to have to report this to Director Voss. We take the health and safety of our staff very seriously. If you're experiencing memory loss, we need to make sure that you're capable of performing the work." After we ended the call, I sat at my desk and I considered the situation. If I left the lighthouse to see a doctor, I would be admitting that something was wrong. I would be admitting that I was not capable of doing this work. I would be returning to the life that I had been trying to escape, or if I stayed, I would have to accept that there were days that I couldn't remember. I would have to accept that parts of my life were lost to me. I would have to continue functioning despite these gaps. I decided to stay. Director Voss called me the next day. "I understand you've been experiencing some memory issues," she said. "I want to make sure that you're all right and that you're capable of performing the work." "I'm fine," I said. "I'm having occasional memory gaps, but nothing that's preventing me from doing my job. The maintenance log shows that I'm completing the work even on the days that I don't remember. So clearly the work is being done correctly." "Have you considered seeing a doctor?" she asked. "I have," I said. "But I don't think a doctor would be able to help. I think this is something I need to manage on my own." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "David, I want to ask you something," Director Voss said. "Before you took this position, you experienced some memory loss, didn't you? You didn't remember your initial interview?" "How did you know about that?" I asked. "Because you told me during our second evaluation," she said. "You mentioned that you had driven to the lighthouse for the initial interview and that you had no memory of it. You said that the memory had gradually returned to you over the course of a week." I tried to remember telling her this, but I couldn't recall the conversation. "I did tell you that?" I asked. "You did," she said. "And I'm wondering if what's happening now is related to what happened then. I'm wondering if your memory is working differently than it did before you came to the lighthouse." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that the lighthouse has a particular effect on certain people," she said. "Not on everyone, but on some people. It's nothing to be afraid of. I just want you to be aware of it." "What kind of effect?" I asked. "A kind of temporal shift," she said. "A way of experiencing time that's different from what you might be accustomed to. Some people experience it as gaps in their memory. Others experience it as a sense of time moving differently. Others report feeling like they're repeating the same day over and over. But everyone who stays long enough adapts to it. I don't understand, I said. I know, she said. And I can't explain it in a way that would make sense to you without you experiencing it yourself. What I can tell you is that this is normal for this place. It happens to most of the keepers. It's not a medical problem. It's just the nature of the lighthouse. Part 8. The Understanding. After we ended the call, I went back to my detailed computer log. I looked at the dates where I'd identified memory gaps. I looked at the entries I'd apparently written in the maintenance log, despite not remembering writing them. I looked at the entries in my computer log for those days, which documented routine activities in meticulous detail. What if Director Voss was right? What if the memory loss wasn't a medical problem, but rather something unique to the lighthouse itself? What could cause this? What property of the lighthouse would affect people's ability to remember their experiences? The lighthouse was built in 1923. It had been automated in the 1970s. It was now maintained by a keeper position that cycled through different employees every few years. According to Director Voss, most keepers experience some kind of memory disturbance. She had described it as a temporal shift and suggested that it was normal for the place. I didn't know what any of that meant, and I couldn't construct a rational explanation for how it could be true. But I also knew that something was definitely happening. The memory gaps were real. The gaps occurred with regularity. They corresponded to specific times and durations. I began to research the history of the lighthouse more seriously. I looked up newspaper articles from the archives. I found some information about the original construction and the early keepers. I found records of repairs and renovations that had been made over the decades. But I found nothing that explained memory loss. I also began to observe myself more carefully. I began to pay attention to the days that seemed to go missing. I tried to see if there was a pattern. I tried to see if there was something specific that triggered the memory gaps. What I noticed was that the days that I lost seemed to follow a precise pattern. They occurred at roughly weekly intervals, approximately 7 days apart. They seemed to correspond to specific times, the same time of day that I always conducted my first inspection. I also noticed something else. On the days that I didn't have a clear memory of, the maintenance log entries were consistent and unchanging, and they all said the same thing. Daily inspection completed. Beacon system functioning normally, no issues observed. It was as if on those particular days, I was performing an automatic routine without conscious awareness. I was doing the work, but I was not experiencing it. I began to wonder if the days that I lost seemed to follow a pattern. They occurred at roughly weekly intervals, approximately 7 days apart. They seemed to correspond to specific times of day. I also began to wonder something else. What if the days that I lost were not arbitrary, but were related to a specific kind of work or activity? I asked Patricia about tour schedules when she called the next week. How often do keepers conduct tours? I asked. It depends on how many visitors come, Patricia said. During peak season, it could be several times a week. During slow periods, maybe only once or twice a week. How many tours have you been conducting? 2 last weekend, I said. I'm trying to keep track of the schedule. You should keep a record of it, Patricia said. It helps us understand visitor patterns. I realized that I had not been keeping a separate record of the tours. I had been performing them and noting them in my general maintenance log, but I had not been tracking them carefully. I began to create a separate log for tours. I would record the date, the time, the number of visitors, any notable events or observations. By the end of July, I had conducted approximately 18 tours. I had records of all of them in my tour log. But in August, something disturbing began to happen. I was having clear memories of conducting tours that I had not recorded in my log. I would remember climbing the stairs with a group of visitors. I would remember describing the beacon system. I would remember the feeling of the wind at the top of the lighthouse. The memory would be vivid and detailed. But when I checked my tour log, there was no entry for that tour. This was different from the memory gaps that I had been experiencing, and before I would lose entire days. Now I was having memories of events that I had apparently not recorded. Either I was failing to record events that I had experienced, or I was remembering events that had not actually occurred. Both possibilities were disturbing. I began to cross-reference my memories with my records, trying to find discrepancies. What I discovered was that my memories of tours did not align with the dates that I had recorded in my log. I would remember conducting a tour on a particular day, but when I checked my records, the date would be different. Or sometimes I would have recorded conducting a tour on a particular date, but when I tried to remember it, the memory would not correspond to the recorded date. I would remember a different group of visitors or a different time of day. My memories and my records were slowly diverging. This realization troubled me more deeply than the simple memory gaps had troubled me. The memory gaps suggested that I was losing experiences that I had definitely had. The divergence between my memories and my records suggested something stranger, that my memories were being created or altered in some way that didn't correspond to what I was actually documenting. By the end of August, I had stopped trying to reconcile my memories with my records. The differences were becoming too numerous and too complex. The act of trying to verify whether my memories matched my records was only increasing my anxiety. Instead, I focused on performing my work. I climbed to the top of the lighthouse. I performed the maintenance checks. I conducted tours when visitors arrived. I recorded what I thought I had done in my logs. Whether what I was recording was accurate or not seemed to matter less and less. Part 9. The photograph director Voss called me in early September. "I wanted to check in with you," she said. "How are you adjusting to the position?" "Fine," I said. "Everything is fine." "Are you still experiencing memory issues?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but it's manageable." "I'm glad," she said. "Suri, we're planning to close the lighthouse for major renovations starting in October. The renovations are expected to take about 3 months. During that time, we'll need to have temporary staffing, and your position as keeper will be suspended. I wanted to give you advance notice so that you could make arrangements." "What kind of renovations?" I asked. "Structural repairs and upgrades to the automated systems," she said. "The lighthouse is getting old, and there are some issues that need to be addressed. The mortar between the stones is deteriorating. Some of the automated systems are outdated. We're upgrading the beacon to a more efficient LED system. Once the renovations are complete, you can resume your position as keeper." I listened to her explain the details of the renovations and the timeline, and I heard myself agreeing to the suspension of my position. I heard myself saying that I understood and that I would make arrangements to leave in late September. But I was not entirely present in the conversation. Part of my mind was considering what it would mean to leave the lighthouse, what it would mean to return to the city and to my isolated apartment and to the work that had been my life before. The thought of leaving the lighthouse filled me with a sense of profound dread. "Is there a problem?" Director Voss asked. "No," I said. "I was just thinking about logistics. I'll need to arrange for a place to stay while the renovations are happening." "The foundation can provide temporary housing," she said. "We have an arrangement with a local hotel. You would stay there while the renovations are in progress. You would still receive your salary during this time. It's in your employment contract." "Thank you," I said. After we ended the call, I went to the top of the lighthouse and I looked out at the ocean. The view was gray and overcast. The sky was the same color as the water. The horizon was barely visible. The entire world seemed to be composed of different shades of gray. The wind was strong, moving in patterns that seemed almost violent. The sound of it was loud and continuous, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere. I stood there for a long time and I thought about what it meant to leave this place. The memory gaps that I had been experiencing, the sense of time moving differently, the feeling of performing actions that I didn't fully remember, the gradual divergence between my memories and my records. All of it was connected to the lighthouse. If I left, would the memory loss stop? Would my sense of time return to normal? Would I be able to remember my experiences with complete clarity, or would something essential be lost if I left? What if the memory gaps were not a problem, but a feature of this place? What if they were part of what made the lighthouse function the way it did? What if they were part of what made it possible to exist here in this particular way? I didn't have answers to these questions. In late September, I packed my belongings and I prepared to leave the lighthouse. The cottage seemed smaller than it had seemed when I first arrived. Without my daily routine to give it structure and purpose, the space became just an empty room. I packed my clothes and my books and my laptop. I left the keys on the desk in the reception building. Director Voss came to the facility to collect the keys and to verify that the facility was secured for the renovations. "I want to thank you for the work you've done," she said. "The lighthouse was well maintained during your tenure. We appreciate your dedication." "Thank you for the opportunity," I said. "The renovation should be completed by late December," she said. "We'll contact you when we're ready for you to resume your position. How do you feel about returning to the lighthouse after the renovations?" "I'm looking forward to it," I said. The truth was that I didn't know how I felt about it. I knew that the prospect of returning made sense to me in an intellectual way, but emotionally I was uncertain. What would it mean to return to a place where my experience of time was fundamentally altered? What would it mean to resume a life where I was losing days on a regular basis? Part final. The return. I drove back to the city and I checked into the hotel that the foundation had arranged. The room was generic and impersonal. Twin beds with a thin comforter. A television mounted on the wall. A desk with a chair. A bathroom with soap and tiny bottles of shampoo arranged on a shelf. After 3 months of living in the keeper's cottage, the hotel room felt enormous and empty. I tried to resume my freelance work. I tried to engage with the articles that I was supposed to write for the publication, but my mind was at the lighthouse. I was thinking about the memory gaps. I was thinking about the time that I had lost. I was thinking about the moment when I had accepted that something fundamental about my experience of time had changed. Throughout the month of October and into November, I remained in the hotel. I conducted my freelance work. I took walks through the city. I tried to reconstruct something like a normal life. But I was not the same person who had arrived in the hotel in late September. Something had changed in me during my time at the Lighthouse. Something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my existence and my experience of time. I began to research the history of the Lighthouse more intensively. I went to the local historical society and I asked about the Lighthouse. The staff there were helpful. They provided me with documents and historical records. I found information about the construction and the original keepers. In one document, I found a mention of the original lighthouse keeper, a man named Thomas Sinclair. The document was from a historical journal published in 1935. It contained an account of Sinclair's tenure at the lighthouse between 1923 and 1928. The account described Sinclair as a dedicated and careful keeper who had maintained the lighthouse with meticulous attention to detail. It mentioned that Sinclair had kept detailed records of his maintenance work and observations about the lighthouse. But there was something odd in the description. The account mentioned that during Sinclair's tenure, the keeper experienced unusual fluctuations in temporal perception and memory loss that he attributed to the isolation of the position. Upon investigation, medical professionals determined that the keeper was in good physical health despite reporting the memory gaps. The keeper continued his work for 5 years, eventually requesting a transfer to a facility in the city, where he lived for the remainder of his life in relative seclusion. I read this passage multiple times. Other keepers had experienced what I was experiencing. The memory loss and the temporal disturbance were not unique to me. They were not new phenomena caused by some recent change in the lighthouse or in how the position was being managed. The original keeper, Thomas Sinclair, had experienced them more than 80 years ago. I wondered if every keeper who had ever worked at the lighthouse had experienced the same phenomenon. I wondered how many keepers there had been. Indeed, how many people had climbed the stairs of the lighthouse, conducted maintenance, performed tours, and felt their memory and sense of time gradually become unreliable. I wondered if the lighthouse was deliberately selecting keepers who would be affected by whatever property of the place caused these disturbances, or if it was simply that anyone who stayed long enough would eventually experience them. In late December, Patricia called me with news. "The renovations are nearly complete," she said. "We're ready for you to return to the lighthouse position. When can you be here?" "I can come back tomorrow," I said. I drove north again along the coastal highway, retracing the route that I had made months ago. The landscape was familiar to me now, the small towns, the way the coastline gradually appeared, the winding road that led to the lighthouse, the parking area, the entrance. When I arrived, the lighthouse facility looked the same as it had when I left. The renovation work had apparently been internal or had involved the maintenance building rather than the exterior structures. Director Voss was waiting for me. "Welcome back," she said. "I hope you've had a good rest. The lighthouse is ready for you." "Thank you," I said. "I'm looking forward to being back." That night, I slept in the keeper's cottage for the second time, and I settled back into the routine that had become so familiar to me. I climbed to the top of the lighthouse. I performed the maintenance checks. I documented my observations in the log. The routine was exactly the same as it had been before. Nothing had changed. But I had changed. Like I moved through the work with a sense of resignation and acceptance that I hadn't possessed before. I accepted that there would be days that I wouldn't remember. I accepted that my sense of time would continue to be unreliable. I accepted that this was simply the nature of the work. In early January, about a week after my return to the Lighthouse, I experienced one of the memory gaps again. I woke up on January 10th, and I realized that I had no memory of January 9th. There was no entry in my detailed computer log for that date. The maintenance log showed the standard entry about the beacon system functioning normally. I had apparently performed my work on January 9th, but I had no conscious experience of it. Rather than feeling disturbed, I felt a strange sense of acceptance. This was how it was going to be, and this was the price of staying at the Lighthouse. This was the nature of the work. This was part of the mechanism of the place. I had accepted this reality before, and I was accepting it again. Throughout January, the memory gaps continued. I experienced days that I lost completely. I would wake up and realize that I had no recollection of the previous day, even though the maintenance log showed that I had performed my duties. I stopped trying to understand why this was happening. I stopped trying to find a logical explanation. I simply accepted it as part of the environment. By February, I'd been at the Lighthouse for approximately 5 months in total, with a 3-month break for renovations. During my second tenure at the facility, I was having memory gaps approximately once per week, and was usually consistent with the schedule that I had observed before. It was during this time, in early February, that I noticed something unusual in the maintenance log. There was an entry dated 2 weeks in the future. It was written in my handwriting. It said, "Daily inspection completed. Beacon system functioning normally. No issues observed." But today was February 3rd. The entry was dated February 17th. I had apparently written an entry for a date that had not yet occurred. I sat at my desk and I stared at this entry for a very long time. I had not written this entry consciously. I had no memory of writing it. It appeared in the maintenance log as if it had always been there. I checked my computer log to see if I had any record of when I wrote it. The timestamp showed that the entry had been created at 11:47 p.m. on February 3rd, earlier tonight. But I had no memory of writing it. I went back through the maintenance log and I looked at all of the entries. I looked at the dates and the times. I tried to see if there were other entries that were dated in the future relative to when I thought they had been written. Most of the entries seemed to correspond to the correct dates. But as I looked more carefully, I began to notice a pattern. Some of the entries that I had thought were from the past were actually undated, or they were dated with a date that seemed wrong in relation to when I thought I had written them. Some entries appeared to be from future dates that had not yet occurred. Some entries appeared to be from past dates that preceded my employment at the Lighthouse. The maintenance log, which I had been keeping carefully and regularly, was actually a confused tangle of dates and times that didn't correspond to a linear timeline. It was as if I had been writing entries from multiple time periods simultaneously, as if my experience of when I was writing each entry was not consistent with the dates that I was assigning to them. I closed the maintenance log and I didn't open it again for several days. When I did open it again, I noticed that the undated or wrongly dated entries had been corrected. They now showed proper dates and times. The entry that had been dated February 17th was now dated February 3rd, with a timestamp that showed it had been written in the early morning rather than late at night. It was as if someone had gone back and corrected the entries while I was not paying attention. But the only person with access to the log was me. I realized that I might be making corrections to the log during the times that I didn't remember. I might be going back through the log and fixing the entries that were dated incorrectly. I might be doing this work during the days that I lost completely. This thought was profoundly disturbing because it suggested that even on the days that I had no conscious experience of, I was still functioning, I was still performing actions, I was still making decisions about how my records should be organized and presented. I was present and aware on those days, just not in a way that I could access later. It was as if there were two versions of me. The conscious version who experienced time in the normal way and had memories of my experiences, and another version who experienced time differently and who performed work and made corrections and wrote entries in the maintenance log, who had thoughts and agency and intention, but whose experiences I could not access. The two versions of me seemed to be in communication with each other. The conscious version would write detailed observations in the computer log. The other version would respond by correcting entries in the maintenance log or by leaving notes in places where I would find them. We were operating in coordination even though we had no direct way of communicating. By the end of February, I had accepted this reality. I had accepted that there were parts of my life that I was experiencing fully and parts that I was experiencing only indirectly through the artifacts that they left behind. I had also begun to understand what Director Voss had meant when she said that the Lighthouse had a particular effect on certain people. The Lighthouse was not causing me to lose time or to experience memory gaps. Rather, the Lighthouse was separating my experience of time into distinct streams. Some of my consciousness was moving forward in linear time, experiencing days sequentially, forming memories of those experiences. But another part of my consciousness was moving through time differently. It was jumping between dates. It was operating outside the constraints of linear causality. It was performing work and making decisions in a way that the linear version of me could only observe indirectly. I was becoming unstuck in time, but not in a way that was terrifying. Rather, it was becoming natural to me. It was becoming simply the way that I existed. In March, I made a choice. I decided that I would stop trying to maintain two separate logs. I decided that I would stop trying to create a record of my experiences that was separate from the maintenance log. I decided that I would allow my life at the Lighthouse to exist entirely within the documentation that I created, regardless of whether that documentation was consistent with a linear timeline. I put away the detailed computer log that I'd been keeping. I focused entirely on the maintenance log, and I stopped worrying about the dates and the times and the apparent inconsistencies. I simply recorded what needed to be recorded, and I accepted that the relationship between the record and my experience of time was no longer straightforward or predictable. It was around this time that I noticed the photograph. I was in the keeper's cottage one evening, and I found a photograph on my desk. It was a photograph of me standing in front of the lighthouse. I was wearing the same clothes that I had been wearing for several days. My hair was windblown. My expression was neutral, neither smiling nor frowning. I didn't remember having this photograph taken. I didn't remember anyone being at the lighthouse to take such a photograph. But there it was, a physical object in my possession, with evidence that it had been developed and printed. I turned it over and I examined the back. There was a date written on it, April 3rd, 1925. But the photograph showed me standing in front of the lighthouse in the modern era, not 97 years ago in 1925. It was impossible, or the date was clearly written in faded ink on the back of the photograph. It was legible and consistent with the handwriting style of the 1920s. It looked authentic, but the lighthouse in the background was the same lighthouse that I was living in now. It was not a different lighthouse. It was not a photograph from a different time period. I realized what the photograph was showing me. It was showing me that I existed at multiple times simultaneously. It was showing me that there was a version of me in 1925 standing in front of this same lighthouse, being photographed by someone. Or it was showing me that I was experiencing time in a way that allowed multiple moments to coexist. I placed the photograph on my desk beside the other items that had accumulated there. The computer that I was no longer using, the pens and notepads, which in the maintenance log. The photograph took its place among these objects as further evidence of something that I was no longer entirely sure I wanted to understand. I was no longer certain about my own temporal existence. I was no longer certain about when I was or what moment I was occupying. But I was no longer afraid of this uncertainty. The spring season came and went. The summer tourist season began again. I conducted tours for visitors who had driven to the facility for the first time. I performed my maintenance duties. I recorded observations in the maintenance log, and I continued to lose time, approximately once per week, on days that seemed to occur in a regular cycle, but that I could not predict in advance. On the days that I lost, I would return to full consciousness and find that entire hours or days had passed. I would find entries in the maintenance log that I didn't remember writing. I would find that my possessions had been rearranged or that new items had appeared in my cottage. I accepted these things without investigation or attempt to understand them, because I was beginning to understand something fundamental about the lighthouse. It was not a place that operated according to the normal rules of time and causality. It was a place where different moments could coexist. It was a place where a person could experience their life across multiple timelines simultaneously. The keepers who worked here did not move forward through time in a linear fashion. Rather, they occupied a kind of suspended state where their experiences could be accessed from multiple directions. The memory gaps were not failures of consciousness, and they were transitions between different temporal streams. I was not becoming sick or unstable or experiencing a psychological breakdown. I was adapting to a different way of existing. By the end of the summer, I had completed approximately 2 years of service as keeper of the lighthouse. Or perhaps it was less time or more time. I was no longer entirely certain about the measurement of duration. One afternoon, Director Voss came to the lighthouse. "I wanted to check on you," she said. "You've been here for quite a while now. How are you managing?" "Fine," I said. "I'm managing well." "You look different," she said, studying me carefully. "Different how?" I asked. "You seem calmer," she said, "like you've accepted something that you were resisting before." "I think I have," I said. "The lighthouse changes people," she said. "Yes, it always does. Some people adapt to the change, others can't. but the ones who adapt often end up staying for a very long time. How long? I asked. The longest keeper we've had stayed for 12 years, she said. Thomas Sinclair stayed for only 5 years. Most keepers stay for 2 to 4 years. But there was one keeper who came back repeatedly. He left and then came back. He left again and came back again. He was here in the 1940s, then he left, then he returned in the 1950s and left again, then returned in the 1970s. It was as if he kept being drawn back to the place. What happened to him? I asked. I'm not sure, Director Voss said. He eventually stopped coming back, or he came back in a way that we couldn't document. There was a period of about 30 years where we have no record of who was working as keeper at the lighthouse. The beacon continued to function and the maintenance logs continued to be written, but we don't have any official record of who was performing the work. I looked at her. Are you suggesting that the lighthouse was maintaining itself? I asked. I'm suggesting that there are aspects of this place that don't fit neatly into the ways that we normally document and understand things, she said. I'm suggesting that people who stay here long enough become part of the fabric of the place itself. What do you mean by that? I asked. I mean that the boundaries between the keeper and the lighthouse begin to dissolve, she said. The person working here begins to exist in synchronization with the place itself. They begin to function as a component of the lighthouse rather than as a person who works at the lighthouse. She paused. I'm telling you this because I think you should know what's happening to you, she said. I think you should be aware that the longer you stay here, the more integrated you become with this place. And at some point, you may no longer be able to leave, or you may find that leaving no longer makes sense. I understand, I said. Do you? She asked. Do you really understand what I'm telling you? I think I do, I said. I think the lighthouse is becoming a part of me, and I'm becoming a part of the lighthouse. I think the line between me and this place is becoming less distinct. Yes, she said, that's exactly what's happening. After Director Voss left, I stood at the top of the lighthouse and I looked out at the ocean. The sun was setting. The sky was turning from blue to orange to purple to gray. The water reflected the colors of the sky. The beacon light began to illuminate, creating a bright beam that cut through the gathering darkness. The beam rotated continuously, moving across the dark horizon, a signal that moved through time and space, marking the presence of the lighthouse. I stood there, and I realized that I could no longer precisely remember when I had first arrived at the lighthouse. The memory existed, but it was vague and uncertain. It seemed to exist in multiple versions simultaneously, each with slightly different details and a different date. I also realized that the distinction between the times when I was consciously present and the times when I was not seemed to be dissolving. I was becoming increasingly conscious during the times that I had previously thought of as blackouts. I was experiencing moments where I was simultaneously aware of multiple points in time. I was perceiving the lighthouse from different moments simultaneously, seeing the seasons change, the light alter, the ocean move, all in the same moment. The memory gaps were becoming less distinct. They were becoming transitions between different states of consciousness rather than absences of consciousness. I was no longer losing time. I was inhabiting time differently. Standing at the top of the lighthouse, I realized that I was no longer certain when I was standing there. Because I might have been standing there at sunset. I might have been standing there at dawn. I might have been standing there at multiple times simultaneously. occupying the same physical location in different moments. I might have been standing there for minutes or hours or days or years. I might be standing there still. And that the memory of arriving at the Lighthouse and the conversations with Director Voss and the months of service might be something that I had already lived through, or something that I was about to live through, or something that I was currently living through. The boundaries of time had become unclear, but I was no longer afraid of this clarity. I was beginning to understand that this was the purpose of the Lighthouse. This was what drew certain people to the position of keeper. Not the work of maintaining the beacon, though that was important, but the transformation that occurred when a person spent enough time here, when they allowed the place to change how they experienced existence. I descended the spiral staircase. I opened the maintenance log. I wrote, "Daily inspection completed. Beacon system functioning normally. No issues observed." And I meant it. The beacon was functioning as it had been designed to function. The system was stable. Everything was in order. I didn't write a date on the entry. I didn't need to. The Lighthouse would know what date to assign to it, or whether a date was necessary at all. I was no longer the keeper of the Lighthouse. I was becoming the Lighthouse. And somewhere, in a moment that was simultaneously occurring and has already occurred and will occur in the future, another version of me was conducting a tour for visitors who had driven to the facility for the first time. Another version of me was being interviewed by Director Voss. Another version of me was arriving in a car after a long drive, wondering how I could have forgotten applying for this position. All of these versions existed simultaneously in different moments, all occupying the same space. And they were all me. Or we were all something that had once been me, transformed by the Lighthouse into something that existed across time rather than through time. The beacon light continued to rotate, cutting through the darkness, visible from far out at sea. A signal that all was well, that the Lighthouse was still here, that something was still maintaining the light. I stood in the keeper's cottage, and I understood that I would never leave this place. Not because I was trapped, but because there was no distinction anymore between me and the Lighthouse. We were one thing, moving through time in a way that time had never intended, existing in all moments simultaneously, unchanging and eternal, and exactly where we belonged.